The sound of screeching tires shattered the calm of the Atlanta evening. Dr. Elijah Moore barely had time to react before a police cruiser swerved onto the curb, cutting him off. He instinctively froze, his heart pounding as the door slammed open and a towering officer stormed out, hand on his gun. "Step away from the car!" Officer Paul Hensley's voice boomed, sharp and commanding, slicing through the hum of evening traffic. Elijah's pulse quickened as he glanced around, his confusion mirrored in the faces of passers-by. Still wearing his hospital scrubs, streaked with sweat and exhaustion from a 12-hour shift, he raised his hand slowly. "Officer, is there a problem?" he asked, his voice steady but wary. Hensley's eyes narrowed as he approached, his every step radiating hostility. "That car isn't yours. Don't even try it." Elijah blinked, his mind racing. This couldn't be happening. Not now. Not after the day he'd had saving lives. "I'm sorry," he said carefully, "but this is my car. I just got off work at the hospital." He motioned toward his scrubs, the stethoscope still hanging around his neck. But Hensley wasn't listening. He was already pulling his radio from his belt, his gaze cold and unrelenting. "Don't move," he barked, his voice louder now, as if volume could make the lie real. It wasn't just a command. It was a warning. The growing tension thickened the air as bystanders began to gather, their murmurs rising like a low rumble. A young woman in a hoodie pulled out her phone, recording the scene. "Hey, what's he doing?" someone in the crowd asked. Elijah's chest tightened. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was something far worse. The officer's hand hovered near his holster, and every muscle in Elijah's body screamed at him to stay still, to not make any sudden movements. "I can show you my ID," Elijah said, his voice calm but layered with disbelief. "My name is Dr. Elijah Moore. This car is registered to me. Just check." But Hensley didn't check. Instead, he stepped closer, invading Elijah's space. "I said don't move." For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Cars slowed as drivers rubbernecked. The crowd's murmurs turned to shouts. "That's his car!" a man yelled. "You're harassing him!" someone else added. The officer ignored them. His focus was locked on Elijah, his suspicion as loud as the sirens that now echoed faintly in the distance. Elijah felt his palms grow clammy as he kept his hands raised. Every nerve in his body screamed for him to defend himself, to explain louder, to make the officer listen. But he couldn't. He knew better. He had learned it from his mother's quiet warnings, from whispered stories passed down in his community. "Keep calm, Elijah," his mother had always said. "When they look at you, they don't see your degrees or your good heart. They just see what they want to see. You have to stay calm, no matter what." And so he stood there, a tall man who had once comforted grieving families and stitched up wounds, now made to feel small and powerless. The officer's glare sharpened as he stepped even closer, so close that Elijah could see the tension in his jaw. "I said don't move." His hand now fully rested on his holster, his fingers twitching. Elijah swallowed hard. His mind flashed to his daughters, little Kayla and Jasmine, waiting at home. Would they be sitting at the dinner table, wondering why Daddy wasn't back yet? Naomi, his wife, would be pacing by now, checking her phone every few minutes. "Officer," Elijah said again, his voice lower but firm, "I am not a threat. My ID is in my pocket. You can see for yourself." Hensley hesitated just for a split second, but the moment passed as quickly as it came. His grip on his belt tightened. "I don't need to see anything. This car matches a stolen vehicle report." Elijah's breath hitched. A stolen vehicle? How? His mind raced for answers. This car was his. He had bought it with the first big paycheck he'd earned as a doctor. It was more than a car to him. It was proof that hard work could overcome anything. "Then run the plates," Elijah said softly. The officer ignored him, turning to glance at the growing crowd instead. A middle-aged man in a suit had joined, shaking his head in disapproval. Another woman stood with her young son, shielding his eyes from the escalating scene. "What are you waiting for?" the man in the suit called out. "Run the plates! Let him go!" Elijah saw the officer's jaw tighten. He wasn't just angry. He was determined to hold his ground. Hensley reached out and grabbed Elijah's arm, yanking it behind his back. A sharp gasp rippled through the crowd, followed by raised voices. "What are you doing?" The young woman with the phone screamed. "You can't do that. He didn't do anything." The cuffs snapped around Elijah's wrists, cold and unrelenting. For a moment he couldn't speak. His mouth went dry as the weight of the cuffs pressed into his skin, but the heavier weight was in his chest. Would his daughters see this video someday? Would they see their father as he was now, restrained and humiliated? Or would they remember him as the man who read them bedtime stories, who told them they could be anything they wanted to be? "You're making a mistake," Elijah said finally, his voice calm but layered with quiet strength. Hensley didn't respond. He marched Elijah to the cruiser, ignoring the shouts of the crowd. Cameras followed every movement, capturing every injustice. As Elijah lowered his head to avoid the cruiser's roof, his eyes caught the young woman still recording. She nodded at him, her phone steady, her expression filled with silent determination. Elijah sat in the back of the cruiser, his heart pounding, but his spirit unbroken. The truth was on his side. And in his mind, one thought stood out above all others. This story isn't over yet. Dr. Elijah Moore sat on the cold, hard bench in the holding cell, his wrists aching from the handcuffs that had only just been removed. He stared at the dull gray walls of the police station, his mind spinning. He wasn't just angry, he was humiliated. The indignity of being marched in here like a criminal, shackled and stared at by officers who didn't see him for who he was, stung more than any physical pain ever could. From a nearby office, he could hear Officer Hensley's voice, loud, confident, lying. "He was acting suspiciously," Hensley said, his words crisp and authoritative. "Didn't comply when I told him to step away from the vehicle. Kept insisting it was his car." Elijah clenched his fists, his jaw tightening as frustration bubbled in his chest. He wanted to scream, to shout the truth, but he knew it wouldn't matter. Not yet. He had learned long ago that raising his voice wouldn't make people listen. It would only give them an excuse to ignore him. He thought of his wife, Naomi. She'd know what to do. She always did. Without hesitation, Elijah reached for the pay phone mounted on the wall. The officer standing guard gave him a sharp look, but didn't stop him. The dial tone buzzed in his ear as he punched in the number he knew by heart. Naomi picked up on the second ring. "Elijah?" Her voice was filled with worry. "What's going on? Are you okay?" He exhaled slowly, forcing himself to sound calm, even as the weight of everything threatened to crush him. "I'm at the police station. They think I stole my own car." There was a pause, then her voice sharpened with determination. "Stay where you are. I'm calling the lawyer and the press." Her certainty steadied him. For the first time since the officer had pulled him over, Elijah felt a flicker of hope. Meanwhile, in the front office, Officer Hensley leaned back in his chair, spinning his tale for the precinct sergeant. "He had this whole story about being a doctor," Hensley said, smirking, "but something about him didn't add up." The sergeant raised an eyebrow. "Did you check his ID?" Hensley shrugged. "Didn't get the chance. He was aggressive. I had to act fast." Outside the station, something was happening that Hensley didn't anticipate. Videos of the arrest had already started circulating on social media, spreading like wildfire. In the clips, Elijah stood calm and composed, his hands raised, explaining who he was. The crowd's voices rang out, accusing the officer of wrongdoing. "This is wrong!" someone shouted in the video. "He didn't do anything." The internet responded with outrage. Tweets, posts, and hashtags flooded timelines. Activists and community leaders took notice. Elijah's colleagues at the hospital, who had long admired his dedication to saving lives, joined in the outcry. By the time Naomi arrived at the station, accompanied by their lawyer, the parking lot was filled with reporters and protesters holding signs. Inside, Elijah sat quietly, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. He tried not to think about the cameras outside, about the reporters asking questions like, "How could this happen?" He tried not to think about his daughters, who were surely watching the news by now. He could almost hear little Kayla's voice. "Why is Daddy on TV?" The guard opened the door and Naomi rushed in. Her expression was a mixture of relief and fury as she reached for his hand. "Elijah, are you okay?" He nodded, grateful for her presence. "I'm fine, just tired." Their lawyer, Mr. Bennett, was already talking to the officers at the desk. His voice carried a quiet authority that commanded attention. "I'd like to see the evidence against my client," he said firmly. "Now!" The sergeant shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Hensley. "We're still investigating," he said weakly. Naomi's eyes narrowed. "Investigating what? You arrested an innocent man without proof." It didn't take long for the truth to come to light. Surveillance footage from the hospital parking lot arrived first, showing Elijah walking calmly to his car after his shift. He unlocked the door with his key, got inside, and drove off. Nothing suspicious, nothing criminal. Mr. Bennett played the footage on his laptop in front of the sergeant, his expression steely. "This is your suspect?" he asked, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "A doctor leaving work?" The sergeant's face paled. "We'll need to look into this further," he muttered, but the damage was already done. As more evidence surfaced, it became clear that the car was indeed registered to Elijah. And then another piece of information emerged. Officer Hensley's record. It wasn't clean. Complaints of racial profiling and excessive force peppered his file, each one more damning than the last. By the end of the day, Elijah was free to go, but the fight was far from over. As he stepped out of the station, blinking against the bright flash of cameras, the crowd erupted in cheers. "Dr. Moore, how do you feel?" a reporter called out. Elijah paused, his heart heavy, but his resolve firm. "I'm grateful for the people who stood by me," he said simply. "But this isn't just about me. It's about making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." As he walked toward Naomi, who was waiting with open arms, he felt a spark of hope. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The room was silent, except for the faint hum of cameras, their lenses trained on the podium at the front. Officer Hensley sat rigidly in his chair, his face pale, hands clenched tightly in his lap. He could feel the weight of the room pressing down on him, the judgment, the disdain, the disgust. The chief of police stepped forward, his footsteps deliberate, his face somber, his voice carried across the room, steady but resolute. "After a thorough investigation, we have found evidence of misconduct and racial profiling by Officer Hensley. Such behavior goes against the core values of this department and the community we serve. Effective immediately, Officer Hensley will be relieved of his duties." A collective murmur rippled through the crowd of reporters and community leaders, followed by the rapid clicking of camera shutters. Hensley's breath caught in his throat. He stared at the chief, his mind racing. How had it come to this? He thought about his career, the years spent building his reputation, the power he had once wielded. Now it was all slipping away. The walls seemed to close in around him as two officers approached to escort him out. Reporters pounced, their voices overlapping as they hurled questions. "Officer Hensley, do you have anything to say to Dr. Moore? Do you admit to racial profiling? Do you regret your actions?" Hensley kept his head down, his lips pressed into a thin line. He didn't answer. What could he say? Outside the station, Dr. Moore watched the live broadcast on a screen set up for the gathered crowd. He stood among the people who had come to support him, friends, neighbors, colleagues, strangers. Each face reflected a mix of relief, pride, and determination. Elijah's heart was heavy, but not with sadness. It was the weight of responsibility, the realization that this moment wasn't just about him. It was bigger than his own experience. As the reporters on screen turned their attention to the chief of police, Elijah caught sight of Naomi standing nearby, her hand resting on their daughter Kayla's shoulder. Naomi gave him a small, reassuring nod. Kayla, wide-eyed, looked up at her father. "Daddy, does this mean the bad man won't hurt anyone else?" Elijah knelt to her level, his voice gentle but firm. "It means he won't be able to do this again, but we have to make sure no one else like him does either. That's why we keep fighting." Kayla nodded slowly, her young mind processing his words. "You're like a superhero," she said with a shy smile. Elijah chuckled softly, ruffling her hair. "Not a superhero, sweetheart. Just someone trying to do the right thing." Later that evening, a rally was held in Atlanta, organized by community leaders and civil rights advocates. The air buzzed with energy as people of all ages and backgrounds filled the streets, holding signs and chanting for justice. Elijah stood on the makeshift stage, the bright lights casting long shadows. He gripped the microphone tightly, his palms slightly damp. Public speaking had never been his favorite thing, but this wasn't about comfort. It was about necessity. He looked out at the crowd, taking a moment to absorb the magnitude of the moment. These people weren't just here for him. They were here for every person who had been wronged, silenced, or overlooked. "Thank you," he began, his voice carrying over the crowd. "Thank you for standing here tonight, for standing with me, and for standing with the countless others who faced injustice." The crowd quieted, hanging on his every word. What happened to me could happen to anyone, but it shouldn't. It's easy to look at this as just one bad officer making a mistake. But the truth is, this goes deeper than one person. It's a system that allows bias to thrive, that ignores the voices of the marginalized, and that turns a blind eye to injustice. His voice grew stronger, more passionate. But tonight, we're here to say enough is enough. We're here to say that every person deserves to be treated with dignity, with respect, and with fairness. We're here to demand change, not just in words, but in actions. The crowd erupted in applause, cheers ringing out into the night. Elijah paused, letting the noise wash over him before continuing. "Hate is loud, but love, unity, and justice, they can be louder. We must rise above hate, but we cannot rise in silence. We must speak, act, and stand together." The crowd roared again, their energy electric. People raised their signs higher, their chants growing louder. As the rally came to a close, Elijah stepped down from the stage, his heart full. Strangers came up to him, thanking him, sharing their own stories, and pledging to join the fight for change. Naomi took his hand as they walked to their car, the night sky stretching out above them. Kayla skipped ahead, her laughter a bright, hopeful sound. Elijah glanced at Naomi, a small smile tugging at his lips. "This isn't over," he said softly. She squeezed his hand. "It's just the beginning." Back at home, as Elijah sat at his desk, he opened his laptop to an outpouring of support online. Comments flooded his social media, with people sharing their experiences and thanking him for his courage. He took a deep breath and typed out a message. "Tonight, we took one step forward, but there's more work to do. Let's keep the conversation going. Share your stories, your thoughts, and your hope. Together, we can create the change we want to see." He hit post and leaned back, his gaze drifting to the teaser board on his desk. Resilience in the face of injustice. Tomorrow, another story would be told. And now it's your turn. What are your thoughts on this story? Have you ever witnessed or experienced injustice? How did it shape you? We'd love to hear your perspective. Share your story in the comments below, and let's keep this important conversation going. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Let's spread awareness and build a community where unity and resilience can thrive. So hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications to join us for the next story.